Stories of Futures Past presents 6 stories featuring Alien Aliens, Volume 2. The Natives by Katherine MacLean. Bad Memory by Patrick Fahy. And the Gods Laughed by Fredric Brown. The Stroller by Margaret St.Clair. Hold On to Your Body by Richard O. Lewis. The Polite People of Pudibundia by R. A. Lafferty. The Natives by Katherine MacLean. Originally published in Science Fiction Stories, 1953. Narrated by Trussel. The old one said, "Stick close by me, child." "What'll it be like, Grandpa?" The youngster was frightened. "Dark, very dark, and big. It moves fast, but we'll keep up with it." The tone was consciously reassuring. "Dark, Grandpa?" "Yes, it sucks heat and absorbs light. You'll find out when you're old and strong enough to swim down to the bottom and see what's there. Now stay with me when we follow it, and don't get lost in the crowd, and don't get ahead of me or get too close to it. You might take in too much and get overcharged." "What's overcharged, Grandpa? Can I really get too much?" The youngster jigged up and down a little with excitement and anticipation. For a moment the oldster turned his attention from watching for the thing that was coming, and considered him fondly. "Poor youngling, I forget. You have had no chance to learn what it means to get enough. You're too young to ride the storms and tap the lightnings. Listen now. When a grown-up has to let out a flash of blue light, that means he's overcharged and spinning off balance inside, and so he has to save himself by letting out his energy to let down the pressure. So be careful. Take enough, but don't be greedy and take in too much too suddenly. Now let's just float here with the others and be ready." It was a beautiful bright day. The sun poured down its flood of light, here and there energizing a molecule of the blue air into little sparkles of ionization, and below, a mist of bright clouds half veiled the darkness that was the bottom. "What's it mean when someone blinks blue lights in lots of flashes and then glows red and starts sinking, Grandpa?" "I'll tell you later when you're older. Just be careful and don't get too close." He was abruptly excited. "Here it comes!" Out of the blue translucence far below, a black dot appeared and grew rapidly, rushing closer until it was a huge fish-shaped object with widespread fins rushing towards them. It would pass slightly to the left of them, and already the waiting crowd was moving to intercept it. It flashed by, and the youngster thought they were going to lose it. It was going so much faster than they. But as the thought crossed his mind, and he saw the 2 churning, glowing openings in its rear, a burning blast of energy struck him. A multitude of glowing, charged particles crackled around him, streamed against him. His fields shifted to reach out and capture them. The spin of stored energy within spun faster, absorbing the new energy into its drive, its life pulse rising to a deep hum, and he felt strong, stronger than he had ever felt before in his life. They were flying faster now, accelerating faster than he had ever flown, and it was easy. They drew up closer to the dark thing, matching it speed for speed, laving in the glowing cloud of energy particles that roared backward from its jets. The youngster was astounded and exhilarated at the tremendous, effortless speed with which they were driving forward. This was the first time he had ever had so much power. It was 10 times more than any aurora borealis with its pale wash of energy waves. Drunken in his newfound strength, he pulled ahead closer to the roaring jets. At the peak of the arc of climb of the New York-Istanbul Stratoliner, high in the ionosphere, where the Earth was merely a giant globe far below. The pilot of the Stratoliner boldly cut the jets for the fuel-saving glide that turned their nose toward Earth again. The radar was clanging its usual senseless warning of imminent collision with some solid objects which had approached closer than the automatic relays considered safe. It had been clanging for several minutes. The pilot glanced in annoyance at the radar screen where several hundred globes, from 2 to 7 feet in diameter, showed vividly trailing the ship in a fan-shaped cluster. "Someday I'm going to take a hammer to that thing." The co-pilot, looking back from the control blister's rear window, saw nothing, as usual, except a few of the shining globes which showed themselves transiently in a brief flash of blue light as they carelessly overloaded and discharged, and one, smaller than the rest, who blinked on and off in rapidly and brilliant flashes of blue. As he watched, it ran suddenly down the color scale to red and began to lag behind, a glowing red globe, sinking. "I wonder what the hell they think they're doing," he grumbled. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Bad Memory by Patrick Fahy, originally published in Galaxy Magazine, December 1960. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Ex-Vector Commander Jim Channing strode purposefully to the reception desk of Planet Enterprises Incorporated. "I want," he told the well-built blonde who was making an interested survey of his lean features, "to buy a planet." "Yes, sir." Her interest evaporated. She took a card from a filing cabinet and handed it to him. "If you will just fill this out." It was a simple questionnaire, type, location, size, and Channing's stylo moved rapidly over it. He hesitated only at the last stark question. "How much are you prepared to pay?" Then he wrote neatly in the space provided, 100,000 credits. That was exactly the amount of his signing-off bonus. It also represented his total finances. The unimaginative minds that calculated the pay of a red-blooded space officer didn't take into account all the attractive ways of spending it that a rumbustious pioneer vector provided. He gave the blonde the card, and she wrote a name on it. The smile she gave him was altogether impersonal. She liked the look of the big, gangling fellow with space written all over his bronzed face and crinkled blue eyes. But she said, "Will you come this way, please?" The name on the desk identified him as Mr. Folan, and he was a tall, affable man. "I think we can suit you, Commander, Mr. Channing," he said, "though what we have in mind mightn't be quite as large as you wish. Earth-type planets come rather high, you know. Now, if you were to choose a Sirius or a Vega type—" "Thank you, no," Jim said firmly. He had heard too much about the hazards of alien-type planets. "In that case," Mr. Folan said busily, "let's see what we have available." A month later, the doors of the automatic shuttle slid across and admitted Jim Channing to the third planet of Phylox Beta. It also disgorged one spaceboat, a clutter of machinery, 1,000 tons of strawberry plants, and a fully equipped house. While he was still taking in the first glimpse of his future home, the massive doors slammed shut and the giant ship took off smoothly and silently. A moment later it winked into subspace. He was in business. The planet possessed only one sizable island. It could hardly be dignified by the name of continent. The rest was covered by a vast ocean. Still, as Folan had explained, he couldn't really expect anything more, not in the line of an Earth type anyway, for the money. He spent a week figuring out the remote controls that operated the planting machinery. Once it clanked into operation, it worked entirely on its own. He had only to push a few buttons to send it lumbering in new directions, and the big island steadily took on a resemblance to a huge strawberry patch while Channing fished and lounged in the sun. When the galactic trade agent came, the strawberries were waiting for him, neatly piled into a mountain of gleaming cans. He was a friendly, talkative little man, glad to exercise his tongue again after the lonely months in space. "What are you growing here?" he asked Channing. "Strawberries." The friendly smile disappeared. "Every planet in the galaxy seems to be growing strawberries this year. I can't even give 'em away." "But I thought the Ursa Major colonies—" The little man shook his head. "So does everyone else. There's 1,000,000 tons of strawberries the colonies can't use headed there already. Now if it was upclin seeds—" "Upclin seeds?" The agent looked at him in surprise. "You mean you haven't heard about upclin seeds?" "No, not a thing." "Well, of course, you're a newcomer. It's this new race that's been discovered somewhere in the sack. They're as rich as all get out, and they have a passion for upclin seeds. Trouble is, they can't grow them on local planets, and they're offering fancy prices to anybody that can supply them. I paid 1,000 credits a bushel for them to your next-door neighbour on the 4th planet last week. Got 100 bushels. Channing did a bit of mental arithmetic. 100,000 credits for one crop. Phew! "Could I grow them here?" The agent shook his head. "You need plenty of soft marsh and a Jupiter-type atmosphere." Then he had a sudden idea, and he spoke long and seriously to Channing, explaining quite a few things that were new to him. Channing was still considering them, staring thoughtfully at the ground after the little man left. Next day, Channing took off for the nearest subspace center, and a few hours later he was in Mr. Folan's office at Planet Enterprises, gingerly balancing his cap on his knee. Mr. Folan's sleek head nodded as Channing made his points, and when it was finished, the executive pressed a buzzer and called for the file. "You realize, Mr. Channing," he said conversationally as he turned over the pages, "that what you are asking for will be the most expensive undertaking." "I know that," Channing said eagerly, "but upclin seeds are such a surefire proposition that I thought Planet Enterprises might be willing to do the job on a percentage basis." Mr. Folan wrote some figures on the margin of the folder and considered deeply. "Yes," he said at last, "I think it would work out on a 70-30 split." 70-30? Mr. Folan inclined his head graciously. 70% for Planet Enterprises and 30 for yourself. Channing said slowly, "That's a bit steep." In a few brisk words, Mr. Folan showed just why he was an executive of Planet Enterprises Incorporated. He gave Channing the figures for transforming the planet's characteristics to those of Jupiter. He told him what acreage of upclin seeds he could grow and the exact profit to be expected. Channing's share should be about 150,000 credits per crop. Fighting a rearguard battle, Channing said, "Your 350,000 won't look so bad on the balance sheet either." Folan reeled off his figures again with practised glibness. Channing had the sudden suspicion that his proposition wasn't entirely unexpected, but the figures sounded reasonable, and he had to admit that Planet Enterprises was risking a great deal of money. "Then there is the not inconsiderable cost of your own metamorphosis, Mr. Channing," Folan added. "Huh?" said Channing. There followed the most excruciating half-hour of Channing's life. Proposition followed explanation, counter-explanation, and followed counter-proposition. At the end of that time he emerged from the office with a stricken look and a small white card. The blonde receptionist read the look correctly, and definitely and finally crossed him off her list. For a Jube, Dick wasn't at all bad-looking. His 4 legs growing directly from the bottom of the muscular hairy trunk were strong and sturdy, always a mark of handsomeness in a male, for the legs had to take most of the strain of a gravitational pull several times that of Earth. He had 3 flexible tentacles, a thin melon slice for a mouth, but nothing resembling a nose. He didn't need one, since he breathed through a set of gills at the sides of his head. He remembered vaguely that he had once been Jim Channing, an Earthman, but the memory had nearly faded. He had been warned of that he would soon forget he had ever been anything except what he was now, but he had already forgotten the warning. Phinox Beta 3 had changed too, in as great a degree. The wide ocean had become a turgid, soupy mush, covered by the trailing growths of the upland flowers. The blue skies had turned an angry red, and the sharp wind that rustled the hair on his squat body was almost pure methane. He waddled down to the low disc-shaped skimmer and started the jets. As it pushed its way through the clinging masses of the upland flowers, he surveyed his crop happily. This was his second crop, and it promised to be even better than the first. It was going to be a very wealthy buck, he told himself. He could buy. His mind floundered. He didn't know what Jubes longed for, what they sought wealth for. He was certain at the same time that there was a flaw in his contentment, that something was missing. What it was missing dropped from the sky a few days later. It came in a spaceboat, and was his neighbour from Phinox Beta 4. Her body hair was a rich golden brown, and she wore pretty bracelets, studded with basim stones on each of her 4 legs. Kim Dick's single eye, with its perpendicular outer eyelids and horizontal nictating inner membranes to filter out the infrared rays, shone with an emotion that was more than pleasure. Her thoughts flooded his mind. There was a warm recognition of his admiration and a delicious suggestion that it wasn't unacceptable. "The agent told me you were upland farming. I came to see if I could be of any help," she told him. The sentences rang like golden bells within his burgeoning consciousness. He tried to shape his answering thought coherently, but his lack of telepathic experience betrayed him. She flinched momentarily beneath the raw, undirected stream of passionate love that overwhelmed her mind. Then an answering wave of shy, tender awareness and acquiescence lathed his senses. Without the clumsy barrier of speech between them, they had scaled in a few pulsating moments the shining heights of love and devotion that human passions sometimes cannot find in a lifetime of searching. Kumduk had never been so happy. They decided to farm the 2 planets together so they could be with each other always. There was sound economic sense in this. With both of them helping, the output of each planet would be nearly doubled. It meant a huge increase in administrative and paperwork for Kumduk, but he didn't mind that. Often as he pored over account books and production figures, a tremulous, shy devotion would envelop him in a gauzy mental cloud, and he would lay down his stylo and answer Alma with all the great love that surged within him. As the months passed, his happiness increased. The perfect attunement of their minds excluded all the scalding jealousies and the offended silences of misunderstanding that can mar the most loving human relationships. They did not need to see each other. The physical presence of the beloved was unimportant. They loved more with their minds than with their bodies. It seemed improbable that such a glorious idyll would ever be disturbed. Then one morning, a shuttle spacer came silently out of the red sky and landed beside the house. Dick waddled toward it, impelled by a carefully built-in series of reflexes which he had completely forgotten about, and entered its gaping maw. He never once looked at Alma, and the passionate entreaties that echoed through his mind only roused in him a dull irritation. Jim Channing again found himself in Mr. Folan's office. The figures the tall, sleek-haired man was reading out to him made tuneful music. Even when Planet Enterprise's massive deduction was made, his share was comfortingly more than $1 million. "Not bad payment, Mr. Channing, for 5 years of life. In any case, it's all over now, just a bad memory." The executive smiled at him from his comfortable, familiar chair, aware of the torrents of confused thoughts hidden behind the grey eyes. When he had come out of the stupor that succeeded the almost disintegrating effects of his re-metamorphosis, Jim Channing remembered clearly the terms of the bargain he had made. He was to become a Jube, a living nightmare, living in a nightmare world, for 5 years. At the end of that time, Planet Enterprises promised him he would be given back his humanity and would have earned enough money to keep him in luxury for the rest of his life. They had kept their promise to the letter. He felt it ungrateful of him that his paramount emotion was fury. He had been happy. No human attachment could ever make him as happy again. He longed for the glorious love and trust he had shared during that tremendous 5 years. Perhaps he had been a repulsive monster from whom any woman would run screaming. But he didn't want a woman. He wanted Alma. He said, picking his words with the greatest care, "Would a further metamorphosis be possible?" Folan's jaw dropped. It was a question he had never expected to hear from any of the men who had taken the terrible choice for the glittering reward he held out to them. Most of them had picked up their vouchers and asked the way to the nearest tavern. Many of the alien races did not find alcohol compatible with their metabolisms. A few had inquired tentatively about his current receptionist. Planet Enterprises had a big turnover in pretty receptionists, but they didn't lose them to men who had been unhuman horrors for 5 years. One big red-haired character had wanted to start a private war against the Syrians, whose brother he had been until 2 days previously. But none of them had wanted to go back. He said, "It's possible, Mr. Channing, but I must tell you that a second metamorphosis is very expensive, and is permanent." "You mean if I become a Jube again, I must stay one?" The executive nodded. Channing gestured toward the payment voucher. "You said it was expensive. Is there enough there to cover it?" Folan looked curiously at him. "Yes, more than enough." He waited to hear what the big man would say next. Channing licked dry lips. A terrible doubt assailed him. Maybe Alma had been metamorphosed too. Maybe she had returned to her former self, whatever that may have been, while he sat here. He looked down at the big freckled hands resting on his knees. They were trembling, and his palms felt moist. "Is the period of metamorphosis always for a term of 5 years?" "Invariably. No other term is possible in the present state of our knowledge of the technique, except permanency." A great sigh escaped Channing. That was all right, then. Alma was genuinely a Jube. The agent had told him about her, mentioned her by name, he remembered now, had said that she was upclin farming on the neighbouring planet. If she had been metamorphosed, she would have been taken from him more than a year ago. He tossed his cap on the table decisively and stood up. "All right, I'll take the permanent treatment." Dick sucked the methane through his gills with satisfaction. It was good to be home again. He had forgotten already that he had ever been Jim Channing, that he would never be human again. He did not know that less than 5 minutes after the shuttle ship had borne him off to Galactic Enterprises, Alma had sent a spaceboat hurtling toward the fiery orb of Phyllox Beta, mad with the grief of having lost him. It would not have concerned him much if he had known. Jubes make tender and devoted lovers, but they are notorious for having exceedingly bad memories. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. And the Gods Laughed by Fredric Brown. Originally published in Planet Stories, Spring 1944. Narrated by Tom Trussel. You know how it is when you're with a work crew on one of the asteroids. You're there, stuck for the month you signed up for, with 4 other guys and nothing to do but talk. Space on the little tugs that you go in and return in and live in while you're there is at such a premium that there isn't room for a book or a magazine, nor equipment for games. And you're out of radio range except for the usual once-a-terrestrial day system-wide newscasts. So talking is the only indoor sport you can go in for. Talking and listening. You've plenty of time for both, because a workday, in spacesuits, is only 4 hours, and that with 4 15-minute back-to-the-ship rest periods, so you actually work only 3 hours and spend half that time getting in and out of the airlock. But those are Union rules, and no asteroid mining outfit tries to chisel on them. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that talk is cheap on one of those work crews. With most of the day to do nothing else, you listen to some real whoppers, stories that would make the old-time liars' clubs back on Earth seem like Sunday school meetings. And if your mind runs that way, you've got plenty of time to think up some yourself. Charlie Dean was on our crew, and Charlie could tell some dillies. He'd been back on Mars in the old days when there was still trouble with the Bowleys, and when living on Mars was a lot like living on Earth back in the days of Indian fighting. The Bowleys thought and fought a lot like Amerins, and even though they were quadrupeds that looked like alligators on stilts, if you can picture an alligator on stilts, and used blowguns instead of bows and arrows. Or was it crossbows that the Amerins used against the colonists? Anyway, Charlie's just finished a whopper that was really too good for the first tryout of the trip. We'd just landed, you'd see, and were resting up from doing nothing en route, and usually the yarns start off easy and believable, and don't work up to real depth of space lying until along about the 4th week, when everybody's bored stiff. So we took this head Bowley, Charlie was ending up, and you know what kind of flappy little ears they've got. I put a couple of zircon-studded earrings in its ear and let it go, and back it went to the others, and then darned if... Well, I won't go on with Charlie's yarn, because it hasn't got anything to do with this story except that it brought earrings into the conversation. When Charlie'd finished, Zebwera stood up and sniffed. "It's getting kind of bad in here," he said. "Reckon I'll go out and get my first shift over with. Anybody want to come?" Ray went with him. Our tug had equipment for only 2 men on work outside at a time, and the rest of us helped them into suits and out the lock, and then settled down for some more talk. There's been nothing else to do. Zeb's remark about the air had been just a crack at Charlie's story, of course. "How do you happen to have zircon earrings along?" Blake Powers asked Charlie when things had quieted down again. Blake was skipper for the voyages, but now that we were anchored down on asteroid, he was just one of the boys, until we took off again. "In with the slum for trading," Charlie said. "When you're going to any place in the system that might be inhabited and you don't know what kind of critters, you take a little of almost everything. You never know what's going to strike the fancy of any civilized or semi-civilized race you might hit. It might be mirrors. I've known dime store mirrors to bring in twice their weight in radium salt. Or it might be paper clips, or harmonicas, or salted peanuts, or plastered statuettes." He turned to me and said, "You know that, Hank. You've been on the first trip or two. So have you, Blake." Blake nodded. "I remember I was on the crew of the ship that landed first on Phobos. You know what the Phobonians turned out to be like, of course. They had about everything we had, and damned if we could do a lick of trading until the captain of our ship put something back in a box and happened to put a rubber band around the box. They went nuts. They'd never seen anything that had elasticity. Rubber or anything like it simply wasn't known on Phobos. We managed to find a few dozen rubber bands in the ship's office and practically bought out Phobos with them. One of the crew was wearing old-fashioned suspenders with elastic in them, and he traded them for a bucket of Phobonian Sealy stones. Had to hold up his pants with a piece of rope for the rest of the trip, but when he got back to Earth, he was rich. Me, I was wearing a belt. I've worn suspenders ever since, but I've never got back to Phobos. Not it would matter if I did. Interplanet's doing a regular trade in rubber there now, and it's down to 20 credits a pound or thereabouts." Blake shook his head gloomily and then turned to me. He said, "Hank, what went on Ganymede? You were on that ship that went out there a few months ago, weren't you? The first one that got through. I've never read or heard much about that trip."
Me either, Charlie said, except that the Ganymedians turned out to be humanoid beings about 4 feet tall and didn't wear a thing except earrings. Kind of immodest, wasn't it? I grinned. You wouldn't have thought so if you'd seen the Ganymedians. With them, it didn't matter. Anyway, they didn't wear earrings. You're crazy, Charlie said. Sure, I know you were on that expedition. I wasn't, but you're still crazy, because I had a quick look at some of the pictures they brought back. The natives wore earrings. No, I said. Earrings wore them. Blake sighed deeply. I knew it, he said. There was something wrong with this trip from the start. Charlie pops off the first day with a yarn that should have been worked up to gradually, and now you say, or is there something wrong with my sense of earring? I chuckled. Not a thing, Skipper. Charlie said, I've heard of men biting dogs, but earrings wearing people is a new one. Hank, I hate to say it, but I just consider it said. Anyway, I had their attention, and now was as good a time as any. I said, if you read about the trip, you know we left Earth about 8 months ago for a 6 months round trip. There were 6 of us in the M94. Me and 2 others made up the crew, and there were 3 specialists to do the studying and exploring. Not the really top-flight specialists, though, because the trip was too risky to send them. That was the 3rd ship to try for Ganymede, and the other 2 had cracked up on outer Jovian satellites that the observatories hadn't spotted from Earth because they are too small to show up in the scopes at that distance. When you get there, you find there's practically an asteroid belt around Jupiter, most of them so black they don't reflect light to speak of, and you can't see them till they hit you or you hit them. But most of them... Skip the satellites, Blake interrupted, unless they wore earrings. Or unless earrings wore them, said Charlie. Neither, I admitted. All right, so we were lucky and got through the belt, and landed. Like I said, there were 6 of us. Lecky, the biologist, Haynes, geologist and mineralogist, and Hilda Race, who loved little flowers and was a botanist, egad. You'd have loved Hilda, at a distance. Somebody must have wanted to get rid of her and sent her on that trip. She gushed, you know the type. And then there were Art Willis and Dick Carney. They gave Dick skipper's rating for the trip. He knew enough astrogation to get us through. So Dick was skipper, and Art and I were flunkies and gunmen. Our main job was to go along with a specialist whenever they left the ship and stand guard over them against whatever dangers might pop up. And did anything pop? Charlie demanded. I'm coming to that, I told him. We found Ganymede not so bad, as places go. Gravity low, of course, but you could get around easily and keep your balance once you got used to it, and the air was breathable for a couple of hours. After that, you found yourself panting like a dog. Lot of funny animals, but none of them were very dangerous. No reptilian life, all of it mammalian, but a funny kind of mammalian, if you know what I mean. Blake said, I don't want to know what you mean. Get to the natives and the earrings. I said, but of course, with animals like that, you never know whether they're dangerous until you've been around them for a while. You can't judge by size or looks. Like if you'd never seen a snake, you'd never guess that a little coral snake was dangerous, would you? And a Martian zizi looks for all the world like an overgrown guinea pig. But without a gun, or with one for that matter, I'd rather face a grizzly bear or a... The earrings, said Blake. You were talking about earrings. I said, oh yes, earrings. Well, the natives wore them. For now, I'll put it that way to make it easier to tell. 1 earring apiece, even though they had 2 ears. Gave them a sort of lopsided look, because they were pretty fair-sized earrings, like hoops of plain gold 2 or 3 inches in diameter. Anyway, the tribe we landed near wore them that way. We could see the village, a very primitive sort of place made of mud huts, from where we landed. We had a council of war, and decided that 3 of us would stay in the ship and the other 3 go to the village. Lecky, the biologist, and Art Willis and I with guns. We didn't know what we might run into, see? and Lecky was chosen because he was pretty much of a linguist. He had a flair for languages and could talk them almost as soon as he heard them. They'd heard us land, and a bunch of them, about 40 I guess, met us halfway between the ship and the village, and they were friendly, funny people, quiet and dignified and acting not at all like you'd expect savages to act toward people landing out of the sky. You know how most primitives react. Either they practically worship you, or else they try to kill you. We went to the village with them, and there were about 40 more of them there. They'd split forces just as we did, for the reception committee. Another sign of intelligence. They recognized Lecky as leader, and started jabbering to him in a lingo that sounded more like a pig grunting than a man talking. And pretty soon Lecky was making an experimental grunt or two in return. Everything seemed on the up and up, and no danger, and they weren't paying much attention to Art and me, so we decided to wander off for a stroll around the outside of the village to see what the country in general was like, and whether there were any dangerous beasties or what-not. We didn't see any animals, but we did see another native. He acted different from the others, very different. He threw a spear at us and then ran. And it was Art who noticed that this native didn't wear an earring. And then breathing began to get a bit hard for us. We'd been away from the ship over an hour, so we went back to the village to collect Lecky and take him to the ship. He was getting along so well that he hated to leave, but he was starting to pant too, so we talked him into it. He was wearing one of the earrings, and said they'd given it to him as a present, and he'd made them a return present of pocket slide rule he happened to have with him. "Why a slide rule?" I asked him. "Those things cost money, and we've got plenty of junk that would make them happier." "That's what you think," he said. "They figured out how to multiply and divide with it almost as soon as I showed it to them. I showed them how to extract square roots, and I was starting on cube roots when you fellows came back." I whistled and took a close look to see if maybe he was kidding me. He didn't seem to be, but I noticed that he was walking strangely and, well, acting just a bit strangely, somehow, although I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I decided finally that he was just a bit overexcited. This was Lecky's first trip off Earth, so that was natural enough. Inside the ship, as soon as Lecky got his breath back, the last 100 yards pretty well winded us. He started in to tell Haynes and Hilda Race about the Ganymedians. Most of it was too technical for me, but I got that they had some strange contradictions in them. As far as their way of life was concerned, they were more primitive than Australian bushmen, but they had brains and a philosophy and a knowledge of mathematics and pure science. They told him some things about atomic structure that excited hell out of him. He was in a dither to get back to Earth where he could get at equipment to check some of those things. And he said the earring was a sign of membership in the tribe. They'd acknowledged him as a friend and compatriot and what-not by giving it to him. Blake asked, "Was it gold?" "I'm coming to that," I told him. I was feeling cramped from sitting so long in one position on the bunk, and I stood up and stretched. There isn't much room to stretch in an asteroid tug, and my hand hit against the pistol resting in the clips on the wall. I said, "What's the pistol for, Blake?" He shrugged. "Rules. Has to be one-hand weapon on every spacecraft. Heaven knows why, on an asteroid ship. Unless the Council thinks someday an asteroid may get mad at us when we tow it out of orbit so it cracks up another. Say, did I ever tell you about the time we had a little 20-ton rock in tow and—" "Shut up, Blake," Charlie said. "He's just getting to those damn earrings." "Yeah, the earrings," I said. I took the pistol down from the wall and looked at it. It was an old-fashioned metal project weapon, 20-shot, circa 2000. It was loaded and usable, but dirty. It hurts me to see a dirty gun. I went on talking, but I sat back down on the bunk, took an old handkerchief out of my duffel box, and started to clean and polish the handgun while I talked. I said, He wouldn't let us take the earring off. Acted just a little funny about it when Haynes wanted to analyse the metal. Told Haynes he could get one of his own if he wanted to mess with it. And then he went back to rhapsodising over the superior knowledge the Ganymedians had shown. Next day, all of them wanted to go to the village, but we'd made the rule that not more than 3 of the 6 of us would be outside the ship at once, and they'd have to take turns. Since Lecky could talk their grunt lingo, he and Hilda went first, and Art went along to guard them. Looked safe enough to work that proportion now. 2 scientists to 1 guard. Outside of that one native that had thrown a spear at Art and me, there hadn't been a sign of danger, and he'd looked like a half-wit and missed us by 20 feet anyway. We hadn't even bothered to shoot at him. They were back, panting for breath, in less than 2 hours. Hilda Race's eyes were shining, and she was wearing one of the rings in her left ear. She looked as proud as though it was royal crown making a Queen of Mars or something. She gushed about it, as soon as she got her wind back and stopped panting. I went on the next trip with Lecky and Haynes. Haynes was kind of grumpy for some reason, and said they weren't going to put one of those rings in his ear, even if he did want one for analysis. They could just hand it to him, or else. Again, nobody paid much attention to me after we got there, and I wandered around the village. I was on the outskirts of it when I heard a yell, and I ran back to the centre of town, but fast, because it sounded like Haynes. There was a crowd around a spot in the middle of, well, call it the compound. Took me a minute to wedge my way through, scattering natives to all sides as I went. And when I got to the middle of things, Haynes was just getting up, and there was a big stain of red on the front of his white linen coat. I grabbed him to help him up, and said, "Haynes, what's the matter? You hurt?" He shook his head slowly, as though he was kind of dazed. And then he said, "I'm all right, Hank. I'm all right. I just stumbled and fell." Then he saw me looking at that red stain and smiled. I guess it was a smile, but it didn't look natural. He said, "That's not blood, Hank. Some native red wine I happened to spill. Part of the ceremony." I started to ask what ceremony, and then I saw he was wearing one of the gold earrings. I thought that was damn funny, but he started talking to Lecky, and he looked and acted all right. Well, fairly all right. Lecky was telling him what a few of the grunts meant, and he acted awful interested. But somehow I got the idea he was pretending most of that interest so he wouldn't have to talk to me. He acted as though he was thinking hard inside, and maybe he was making up a better story to cover that stain on his clothes and the fact that he'd changed his mind so quick about the earring. I was getting the notion that something was rotten in the state of Ganymede, but I didn't know what. I decided to keep my yap shut and my eyes open till I found out. I'd have plenty of time to study Haynes later, though, so I wandered off again to the edge of the village and just outside it. And it occurred to me that if there was anything I wasn't supposed to see, I might stand a better chance of seeing it if I got under cover. There were plenty of bushes around, and I picked out a good clump of them and hid. From the way my lungs worked, I figured I had maybe half an hour before we have to start back for the ship. And less than half that time had gone by before I saw something. I stopped talking to hold the pistol up to the light and squint through the barrel. It was getting pretty clean, but there were a couple of spots left up near the muzzle end. Blake said, "Let me guess, you saw a Martian traghound standing on his tail singing Annie Laurie." "Worse than that," I said. "I saw one of those Ganymede natives get his legs bit off, and it annoyed him." "It would annoy anyone," said Blake. "Even me, and I'm a pretty mild-tempered guy. What bit them off?" "I never found out," I told him. "It was something under water. There was a stream there, going by the village, and there must have been something like crocodiles in it. 2 natives came out of the village and started to wade across the stream. About halfway over, one of them gave a yelp and went down. The other grabbed him and pulled him up on the other bank, and both his legs were gone just above the knees. And the damnedest thing happened. The native with his legs off stood up on the stumps of them and started talking, or grunting, quite calmly to his companion, who grunted back. And if tone of voice meant anything, he was annoyed. Nothing more. He tried walking on the stumps of his legs and found he couldn't go very fast. And then he gave a gesture that looked for all the world like a shrug, and reached up and took off his earring and held it out to the other native. And then came the strangest part. The other native took it, and the very instant the ring left the hand of the first one, the one with his legs off, he fell down dead. The other one picked up the corpse and threw it in the water, and went on. As soon as he was out of sight, I went back to get Lecky and Haynes and take them to the ship. They were ready to leave when I got there. I thought I was worried a bit, but I hadn't seen anything yet. Not till I started back to the ship with Lecky and Haynes. Haynes, first thing I noticed, had the stain gone from the front of his coat. Wine, or whatever it was. Somebody'd managed to get it out for him, and the coat wasn't even wet. But it was torn, pierced. I hadn't noticed that before. But there was a place there that looked like a spear had gone through his coat. And then he happened to get in front of me, and I saw that there was another tear or rip just like it, in back of his coat. Taken together, it was like somebody'd pushed a spear through him, from front to back, when he'd yelled. But if a spear had gone through him like that, then he was dead. And there he was, walking ahead of me back to the ship, with one of those earrings in his left ear. And I couldn't help but to remember about that native and the thing in the river. That native was sure enough dead too, with his legs off like that, but he hadn't found it out until he'd handed that earring away. I can tell you I was plenty thoughtful that evening, watching everybody, and it seemed to me that they were all acting strange. Especially Hilda. You'd have to watch the hippopotamus acting kittenish to get an idea. Haynes and Lecky seemed thoughtful and subdued, like they were planning something, maybe. After a while, Art came up from the glory hole, and he was wearing one of those rings. Gave me a kind of shiver to realize that. If what I was thinking could possibly be true, then there was only me and Dick left, and I'd better start comparing notes with Dick pretty soon. He was working on a report, but I knew pretty soon he'd make his routine inspection trip through the storerooms before turning in, and I'd corner him then. Meanwhile, I watched the other 4 and got surer and surer, and more scared. They were trying their darndest to act natural, but once in a while one of them would slip. For one thing, they'd forget to talk. I mean, one of them would turn on to another as though he was saying something, but he wouldn't. And then, as a remembering, he'd start in the middle of it, like he'd been talking without words before, telepathically. And pretty soon Dick gets up and goes out, and I followed him. We got to one of the side storerooms, and I closed the door. "Dick," I asked, "have you noticed it?" And he wanted to know what I was talking about. So I told him. I said, "Those 4 people out there, they aren't the ones we started with. What happened to Art and Hilda and Lecky and Haynes? What the hell goes on here? Haven't you noticed anything out of the ordinary?" And Dick sighed, kind of, and said, "Well, it didn't work. We need more practice then. Come on, and we'll tell you all about it." And he opened the door and held out his hand to me, and the sleeve of his shirt pulled back a little from the wrist, and he was wearing one of those gold things, like the others, only he was wearing it as a bracelet instead of an earring. I was too dumbfounded to say anything. I didn't take the hand he held out, but I followed him back into the main room. And then, while Lecky, who seemed to be the leader, I think, held a gun on me, they told me about it. And it was even screwier and worse than I dare guess. They didn't have any name for themselves, because they had no language, what you'd really call a spoken or written language, of their own. You see, they were telepathic, and you don't need a language for that. If you try to translate their thought for themselves, the nearest word you could find for it would be we, the first-person plural pronoun. Individually, they identified themselves to one another by numbers rather than names. And just as they had no language of their own, they had no real bodies of their own, nor active minds of their own. They were parasitic in a sense that Earthmen can't conceive. They were entities, apart from, well, it's difficult to explain, but in a way they had no real existence when not attached to a body they could animate and think with. The easiest way to put it is that a detached, earring god, which is what the Ganymedian natives call them, was asleep, dormant, ineffective, had no power of thought or motion in itself. Charlie and Blake were looking bewildered. Charlie said, "You're trying to say, Hank, that when one of them came in contact with a person, they took over that person and ran him and thought with his mind, but, kept their own identity? And what happened to the person they took over?" I said, as near as I could make out, he stayed there too, as it were, but was dominated by the entity. I mean, there remained all his memories and his individuality, but something else was in the driver's seat, running him. Didn't matter whether he was alive or dead either, as long as his body wasn't in too bad shape. Like Haynes, they'd had to kill him to put an earring on him. He was dead, in that if that ring was removed, he'd have fallen flat and never got up again, unless it was put back. Like the native whose legs had been cut off, the entity running him had decided the body was no longer practicable for use, so he handed himself back to the other native, see? And they'd find another body in better shape for him to use. They didn't tell me where they came from, except that it was outside the solar system, nor just how they got to Ganymede. Not by themselves, though, because they couldn't even exist by themselves. They must have got as far as Ganymede as parasites or visitors that had landed there at some time or another, maybe millions of years ago, and they couldn't get off Ganymede, of course, till we landed there. Space travel hadn't developed on Ganymede. Charlie interrupted me again. "But if they were so smart, why didn't they develop it themselves?" "They couldn't," I told him. "They weren't any smarter than the minds they occupied. Well, a little smarter in a way, because they could use those minds to their full capacity, and people, terrestrial or Ganymedean, don't do that. But even the full capacity of the mind of a Ganymedean savage wasn't sufficient to develop a spaceship. But now they had us. I mean, they had Lecky and Haynes and Hilda and Art and Dick, and they had our spaceship, and they were going to Earth because they knew all about it and about conditions there from our minds. They planned, simply, to take over Earth and, run it. They didn't explain the details of how they propagate, but I gathered that there wouldn't be any shortage of earrings to go around on Earth. Earrings or bracelets or however they'd attach themselves. Bracelets probably, or arm or leg bands, because wearing earrings like that would be too conspicuous on Earth, and they'd have to work in secret for a while. Take over a few people at a time, without letting the others know what was going on. And Lecky, or the thing that was running Lecky, told me they'd been using me as a guinea pig, that they could have put a ring on me, taken me over, at any time. But they wanted to check on how they were doing at imitating normal people. They wanted to know whether or not I got suspicious and guessed the truth. So Dick, or the thing that was running him, had kept himself out of sight under Dick's sleeve, so if I got suspicious of the others, I'd talk it over with Dick, just as I really did do. And that let them know they needed a lot more practice animating those bodies before they took the ship back to Earth to start the campaign there. And well, that was the whole story, and they told it to me to watch my reactions as a normal human. And then Lecky took a ring out of his pocket and held it out toward me with one hand, keeping the pistol on me with the other hand. He told me I might as well put it on, because if I didn't, he could shoot me first and then put it on me, but that they greatly preferred to take over undamaged bodies, and that it would be better for me too that is, if my body didn't die first. But naturally, I didn't see it that way. I pretended to reach out for the ring, hesitantly, but instead I batted the gun out of his hand and made a dive for it as it hit the floor. I got it too, just as they all came for me, and I fired 3 shots into them before I saw that it wasn't even annoying them. Damn it! The only way you can stop a body animated by one of those rings is to make it fix it so it can't move, like cutting off the legs or something. A bullet in the heart doesn't worry it. But I backed to the door and got out of it, out into Ganymedean night, without even a coat on. It was colder than hell, too, and after I got out there just wasn't any place to go, except back in the ship, and I wasn't going there. They didn't come out after me, didn't bother to. They knew that within 3 hours, 4 at the outside, I'd be unconscious from insufficient oxygen, and the cold or something else didn't get me first. Maybe there was some way out, but I didn't see one. I just sat down on a stone about 100 yards from the ship and tried to think of something I could do, but I didn't go anywhere with a but, and there was a moment's silence, and then Charlie said, "Well?" and Blake said, "What did you do?" "Nothing," I said. I couldn't think of a thing to do. I just sat there. "Till morning?" "No, I lost consciousness before morning. I came to while it was still dark in the ship." Blake was looking at me with a puzzled frown. He said, "The hell? You mean?" And then Charlie let out a sudden yip and dived head first out of the bunk he'd been lying on and grabbed the gun out of my hand. I'd just finished cleaning it and slipped the cartridge clip back in. And then, with it in his hand, he stood there staring at me as though he'd never seen me before. Blake said, "Sit down, Charlie. Don't you know when you're being ribbed? Better keep the gun just the same." Charlie kept the gun all right, and turned it around to point at me. He said, "I'm making a damn fool out of myself all right, but, Hank, roll up your sleeves." I grinned and stood up. I said, "Don't forget my ankles, too." There was something dead serious in his face, and I didn't push him too far. Blake said, "He could even have it on him somewhere else, with adhesive tape. I mean, on the 1,000,000 to 1 chance that he wasn't kidding." Charlie nodded without turning to look at Blake. He said, "Hank, I hate to ask it, but—" I sighed, and then chuckled. I said, "Well, I was just going to take a shower anyway." It was hot in the ship, and I was wearing only shoes and a pair of coveralls. Paying no attention to Blake and Charlie, I slipped them off and stepped through the oil silk curtains of the little shower cubicle and turned on the water. Over the sound of the shower, I could hear Blake laughing and Charlie cursing softly to himself. And when I came out of the shower, drying myself, even Charlie was grinning. Blake said, "And I thought that yarn Charlie just told was a dilly. This trip is backwards. We'll end up having to tell each other the truth." There was a sharp rapping on the hull beside the airlock, and Charlie Dean went to open it. He growled, If you tell Zeb and Ray what chumps you made out of us, I'll beat your damn ears in, you and your earring gods. Portion of telepathic report of number 67843 on asteroid J864A to number 5463 on Terra. As planned, I tested credulity of terrestrial minds by telling them the true story of what happened on Ganymede, found them capable of acceptance thereof. This proves that our idea of embedding ourselves within the flesh of these terrestrial creatures was an excellent one, and is essential to the success of our plan. True, this is less simple than our method on Ganymede, but we must continue to perform the operation upon each terrestrial being as we take him over. Bracelets or other appendages would arouse suspicion. There is no necessity in wasting a month here. I shall now take command of the ship and return. We will report no ore present here. The 4 of us who will animate the 4 terrestrials now aboard this ship will report to you on Terra.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Stroller by Margaret St.Clair. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, August 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. All sorts of things come in on a space freighter. Even in the old days, grocers were always finding 20-foot pythons curled cosily inside bunches of bananas from South America. And what sort of undesired stowaways do you suppose you get when you have a cargo of tongarus from South Venus, agitized Fiala corums from the distant around Aphrodisian, hand-painted lumigraphs on Gur fibre made in Marsport Prefecture, and golden rinks jewellery from the canal centres? George Saunders, supercargo of the SS Trito, gave his wife a warm kiss on the cheek. "For Pete's sake," he hissed into her ear, "act like you're glad to see me, can't you? The old man's watching us." Martha Saunders hesitated a moment, and then threw her plump body into her husband's arms. "Oh, Georgie," she squealed, "you sweet old thing, it's so wonderful to see you again." "That's enough," George rumbled warningly. He was swaying a little from the impact. "Don't want to overdo it. Let's get out of here." They started over to the parking area of the spaceport where their copter was. "What's the matter?" Martha demanded as soon as they were out of earshot of the ship. "What do you care what the captain thinks about us?" "Listen, Martha. The old fool's been riding me ever since we left Aphrodisian. Says I'm the most incompetent supercargo he's ever had. Just before we docked today, he said he thought he'd take it up with the Union. If he does, you know what'll happen. Pink said the last time that if he got one more complaint about me, he'd take the case to the executive board. I'd lose my license, sure." "Oh." Martha seemed unwillingly impressed. She got an atomizer out of her hand case and began spraying quick-drying Cosmilac over the skin on her face and neck. "But what happened?" she asked an instant later when the cosmetic had set. "Why is he so down on you?" For a moment the fine-etched lines of irritation and petulance faded from George Saunders's face, to be replaced by an expression of honest perplexity. "Martha, Wait, here's the copter. I'll tell you about it after we get in. And for the love of heaven, don't drop any pop bottles out of the window the way you did the last time I was in port. Having the air police after us will be the last straw as far as my nerves are concerned." He slid into the driver's seat. Martha got 2 bottles of pop out of the refrigerator, shoved straws into their necks, pulled a shelf out of the panelling to hold one bottle at a convenient level under George's nose, and began drinking out of the other herself. "Well?" she asked after a couple of swallows. George drank from his bottle before replying. "It's the darndest thing. I remember beginning to load number 2 in 3 holes at Aphrodisian, and I remember telling the longshore leaderman to have the hatch covers put on again when the holes were filled. But there's 6 or 8 hours in there during the loading I don't remember a single thing about. They're totally gone." Well, the way the ship handled at the takeoff from Aphrodite, the old man thought there must be something wrong, and when we were out in space he went in for a look. Wow, I can see sort of why he's sore. Those holes look like somebody'd stirred the things in 'em up with a big stick. About a third of the cargo's ruined. The Tongarus have leaked all over those blasted lumigraphs, and, well, the insurance company is going to raise blue murder, and the owners won't like it one little bit. George licked his thin lips. What I want to know, he burst out, is what happened to me. I must have told the longshoremen to load the holes like that, but when we were 2 days out of Venus, I asked Sparks. He's had a pre-medical course and he's saving up the tuition for medical school, to look me over. He gave me all the tests, dozens of 'em, and finally told me there wasn't a thing wrong with me mentally or physically, except that I needed more rest. Rest, bourgeois. I've been sleeping 10 hours a night, and I wake up tireder than when I went to bed. Martha studied him. You do look sort of tired, she observed. Maybe you need some Vita-Ray treatments. George ignored this comment. Of course, the old man's not such a bad guy, he said. He never said anything about that time I missed the ship at Marsport. You mean that time you were so drunk on Soma? One of the times. George gave an irritated shrug. Never mind that, he snapped. I mentioned it because I asked him to have dinner with us on Thursday, the day before we sail, and I want you to have a real old-fashioned home-cooked meal for him. Maybe I can soften him up, have something nice for him. None of this complete meal stuff out of the freezer. Have something good, out of cans. You mean like my canned crab and mushroom casserole? Have that. And what's that dessert you make with the canned peaches on the Soma? Pêche flambée or something. You might like that. George set the copter down neatly on the roof of the apartment house. Remember, he said, I've got to make a good impression on him. Flatter him as much as you can, but use your head about it. And if you get any kind of chance to tell him about how reliable I usually am, do it. The day moved on toward Thursday. George continued to complain of fatigue, and on Tuesday night Martha woke up shrieking with a vague and horrible nightmare, but it was attributed to indigestion. After a dose of antacid, she went back to sleep. On Wednesday, she had her hallucination. She was putting a bunch of old digests and tabloids away in the closet of the living room when she came across the jacket George had used 4 or 5 years ago when he went grotch hunting. George, she called. Oh, George, can I throw your old grey jacket away? It's full of moth holes. What are you yelling at me for? George asked irritably from behind her. He had been sitting in his study, and was only about 5 feet distant from the closet, drinking Soma. I'm right here. Martha came out of the closet and stared at him. One hand went to her heart. The pallor of her heavy, sagging face showed through a thick face lacquer as a muddy grey. What? I saw you go into the kitchen, she said. You were wearing your brown suit. I was looking right at you, and you walked the length of the living room and went into the kitchen and closed the door behind you. That's why I yelled at you. You were wearing your brown suit. You got the blue one on now. You were wearing your brown suit. Shut up, George said passionately. Are you trying to drive me crazy? I've been sitting right here all the time. What do you mean you saw me walk into the kitchen? You couldn't have. I've been sitting here all the time. But I saw you. You were wearing your brown suit. You imagined it, her husband shrieked at her. It's your imagination. You shut up. What are you trying to do? Get me so nervous the old man will think I'm ready for the loony bin? You imagined it. Martha looked at him. She had to lick her lips twice before she could answer. Yes, of course. That must be it. I imagined it. George spent the rest of the day drinking Soma and holding his hands up before his eyes to see if they had stopped shaking. Martha got a 5-suit deck of cards out of the closet and played solitaire. None of her games came out, but she was too distraught to realize that she had left 2 of the cards inside their box.
Surprisingly, both George and Martha slept well. They awakened far more cheerful than they had been the night before. Even their pre-breakfast snapping at each other lacked its usual note of bitter sincerity. When Martha left the apartment and started out to do her shopping, she was humming under her breath. The canned crab was easy enough to locate, but she had to go to 3 stores before she could find the peaches and the mushrooms. She ran them to earth at last in a little grocery on a side street. Just as she was leaving it, her eye caught the flash of a red label on a rose shelf near the door, and she triumphantly dug out 2 cans of tomato soup. "See what I got," she said, showing her prize to George when she got back home. "I guess I'm lucky or something. It's awfully hard to find." "Gosh," George shut off the video to give her his full attention. "That's wonderful. I happen to know the old man's crazy about it. His mother used to have it all the time. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it makes him change his mind completely about going to the Union. Martha, you're a smart girl." Martha spent the rest of the day at the beauty shop, getting her hair re-garnished with galloons and her face set. She wanted to make the best possible impression on the captain. Around 5:30, she began getting dinner. It doesn't take long to open cans. And an hour or so later, the old man, his name was Corse, was chiming at the door. Corse was definitely stiff at first. He greeted Saunders with resentful formality, and gave Martha the merest flash of a smile before his face grew hard again. When the fragrant steam from the tureen of tomato soup Martha was bringing in blew toward him, he relaxed somewhat, and the salad of canned string beans, onions, lettuce, and mayonnaise softened him still more. By the time he had finished 2 big helpings of Martha's crab casserole, it began to look like the job was saved. He offered George a cigar, and began telling him a long story about what the little Martian hostess at the Silver Wheaterette had said to him. Martha went out in the kitchen to fix the pêche flambée. She cut sponge cake into neat rounds, spread discs of hard frozen banana ice cream over them, and crowned the structure of each dessert plate with half of an enormous canned clingstone peach. From a bottle she poured Soma carefully over each of the peaches, set a bit of paper to burning by pressing it against the element in the atomic range, and then used the paper to ignite the Soma on the peaches. "George," she called in direction of the dining apps. "Oh, George! Honey, help me with the plates." She heard him come in. She turned at his step, ready to pick up the plates, 1 in each hand, and give them to him. He was wearing his brown suit. But he was wearing the green one today, wasn't he? Because it was the best suit he had, and he wanted to impress the captain. His green. George's face slipped down toward the 4th button on his coat. It wavered, solidified, flowed back into place, and then slopped down over his lapels once more. Suddenly it solidified into a sort of tentacle. It came faltering towards Martha, half-blind but purposive. Martha tried to scream. Her throat was too constricted by terror to let out more than a mere thread of sound, but it had carrying power. George and Corse, out in the dining apps, heard it. They came running in. Corse was quick-witted. He picked up one of the plates with the Soma burning on it, and hurled it straight at the thing that was wearing George's clothes. There was an explosion, so loud that the plexiglass in the windows bulged outward for a moment, and then a bright, instant column of flame. Then nothing. George's brown suit lay collapsed and empty on the floor. "It was wearing your suit, George," Martha said hysterically. She was leaning back against the wall, looking faint and sick. "George, it was wearing your suit. Oh, what was it? What was it anyway?" Corse was looking at the debris on the floor. A peculiar expression, half satisfaction, half private insight, hovered around the corners of his lips. "It was a mocker, I think," he answered. "A mocker? What?" You still find a few of them in the wilder parts of Venus. They're parasitic, entities that feed on the life force,
as well as the flesh of human beings. No doubt this one came aboard the ship at Aphrodite, in that consignment of Fiela Corums. They're invisible most of the time, so of course we didn't suspect it. But how did it get here? George demanded. Why did it pick on Martha as a victim? Well, you see, the usual way a mocker works is to select someone as a host, as a sort of base of operations, and then range out from him whenever it wants to eat. For some reason, whenever it leaves its host, it takes on its feature and body and dresses itself in its clothes. That's what happened here. One of the first signs that a mocker is taking hold is a spell of amnesia, and of course that's what happened to you, Saunders, when we were taking on cargo at Aphrodite, though I didn't realize it at the time. A mocker doesn't usually kill its host directly, but it does draw on its life force to keep itself going, and it usually complains of feeling worn out and tired. Course halted. Martha looked down at her husband's brown suit and the ice cream slowly melting across it. Please, George, pick up that stuff before it ruins your suit completely, she said automatically. And then to Course, But what happened when you threw the plate at it? What happened? Oh, I was so scared. Yes, the mockers are terrifying, Course agreed. He seemed to square his broad shoulders. However, at bottom they are unintelligent. Look at the stupidity of this one in attacking you when your husband and I were in the next room. And they are really not especially dangerous, provided you know the defense against them. You see, their body structure, while based on the same elements as our own, involves large quantities of free hydrogen between the body cells. Hydrogen ignites in ordinary air with explosive force. The end product's water, and when I threw that burning stuff at the creature, the hydrogen in its tissues exploded. It blew up. There's probably a good deal more water vapor in the air in this room than there was before I got rid of the thing. Course cleared his throat. There's another life form, he said with a faintly professional air, allied with the mocker, but with important differences which is far more dangerous. That's the Stroller. The Stroller? Martha asked. George had put his arms around her. They were not an affectionate couple, but the moment seemed to call for tender demonstration. Why do they call it that? No one knows exactly. It seems to come from the creature's own name for itself, for its fondness of taking long, long walks. Course turned the cigar in his mouth. He poked at the suit lying on the floor with the toe of his shoe. What does it do? Martha queried. Why is it so terribly dangerous? The Stroller doesn't hunt a host like the mocker, Course replied. Early in life, it takes over the identity of some human being, and it remains indistinguishable from a human being to any usual tests. It's so dangerous because there's absolutely no defense against it. No free hydrogen in its tissues. It's indestructible. My, Martha said. Goodness. It feeds, like the mocker, on both the flesh and the life force of human beings. Fortunately, Course smiled, it's very, very rare. There are probably only a few Strollers in the entire solar system, and they reproduce only at wildly separated intervals. Once more Course halted, and poked absently at the clothing on the floor with the toe of his boot. There's a peculiarity about their feeding habits, he said. They'll go for years without feeling any desire to eat their special food, and then something will happen which makes them greedy. And after that, they can't be stopped before they feed. Goodness, Martha said again. She hid a nervous yawn behind her hand. George, get me a chair, will you? I'd like to sit down. To Course, she said. How did you find out all these things? You must have made quite a study for the subject. Why, I've read several books about Venus, and I listened to all the casts on the video about it, but I've never heard either of these creatures mentioned before. It seems to be a sort of hobby of yours. George pushed a kitchen chair out for her,
He sat down with a sigh of relief. Not a hobby, Cause corrected gently. His face began to waver and flow, as the mockers had done. Then it snapped back into place. He licked his lips very delicately. You see, I'm a stroller myself, and somehow I'm feeling that I'd like to eat.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Hold Onto Your Body by Richard O. Lewis. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, October 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Fidwell, I said, why don't you go lose yourself? He stared at me uncomprehendingly for a full 3 seconds. Then a glimmer of understanding leaped into his beady little eyes, and he got up from the chair before my desk and started happily toward the outer door of the office. "Okay, Mr. Nelson," he said over a thin shoulder. "Just whatever you say." "Better still," I amended, tapping the glass top of my desk with manicured nails. "Go shoot yourself." He nodded blithely. "Just as you say, TJ, just as you say." He always called me TJ when he felt that I was giving him a measure of attention. "Wait," I said, as he reached the door. "Do you by any chance own a gun?" He turned, a frown spreading between his mousy brows. "No," he said slowly, "I don't." Then he brightened. "But I could purchase one." "Fine," I said, tossing him a bill. "Buy a couple of bullets for it, too." He caught the money, smiled, nodded, and left, closing the door softly and respectfully behind him. Humming a merry little tune, I turned to the papers upon my desk. The partnership contract between James Fidwell and T.J. Nelson. If one of the partners should die from any cause, the other partner would become sole owner of the Remy Company. They seemed quite in order. I shuffled them into a neat pile and cut an intricate little dance step on my way through the files with them. The partnership was soon to reach a happy culmination. Suicide has it all over murder, you know. No silly questions from the police, no mess to clean up, no body to get rid of. The relatives usually take care of all that. No bother at all, really. I skipped back to the desk, flipped up the telephone, and began poking a finger into the little holes in the dial. "Mr. Pasquamine," I chimed, after hearing the faint click at the other end of the wire. "Yes?" "This is TJ, I said, chummily. "You still own that block of floating stock in the Remy Company, don't you?" "Yes." "Fine, fine," I complimented. "Bring it over to my office as soon as possible. And by the way," I added, casually, "have it transferred to my name, you know." "Yes." He was in my office in less than an hour, his fat hulk sweating and panting in the chair before my desk, the heavy lids drooping over his black eyes. The stocks were piled neatly before me. I thumbed through them. They seemed to be quite in order. I skipped across the room to the files with them. "Pasquamine," I said, returning to my desk and handing him a cheap cigar. "Do you by a chance own a gun?" He shook his fat head. "No." "Do you have at home, perchance, a rope?" I glanced at his obese body. "A good stout one?" "No." "A knife, perhaps? A good sharp one?" His oily face beamed quickly. "Ah, Mr. Nelson, that I have. Sharp for the salami." He kissed his thick fingers and made a flipping motion in the air with them. "Sharp for the good big salami." "Excellent," I nodded quick approbation. "Go home and cut your throat with it." He pushed his hulk up from the chair and walked toward the door. And don't bother about coming back to the office afterwards, I admonished. He paused, hand on the knob, and turned. Then his round face lighted up. "Ah, Mr. Nelson," he chuckled, "you make with a joke." "Sure," I smiled. "And now you go home and make with a knife." That was the last time I saw Pasquamine. Except at the funeral, of course. He made a lovely corpse, considering everything. It was the day following the funeral when there came a gentle tapping at my office door. "Come in," I said, tossing the half-finished bottle of gin back into the lower drawer. They didn't bother about opening the door. They just crawled under it. A moment later, they had slithered across the floor, had wiggled their way up to the top of my desk, and had flattened out upon its polished surface in complete pseudopod relaxation. Gif and Gil, my two very good friends. "Sorry, boys," I said after we had exchanged the usual amenities, "that I had to get rid of your symbiotics in such a messy fashion. But business is business, you know, and I felt that the time was right." Gif shrugged gelatinously. "I was getting tired of occupying Fidwell anyway," he vibrated. "Regular old pussyfoot. Never had no fun." Gil burped resoundingly in the middle. "I hope the next body I get doesn't turn out to be another wine-guzzling garlic-eater." A tremor ran through him. "It upsets me frightfully." "Time and the rising tide of accidents will tell," I soothed. "I'm cold," trembled Gif, "since I ain't got nobody to keep me warm." "You might try my secretary," I offered playfully. "There's a body for you." "You know I can't," he vibrated. "She ain't even dead yet." "Nearest thing to it," I commented. "This side of the precinct morgue." That brought a shake of mirth from Gil, who really has a truly remarkable sense of humour. Gif, ignoring the levity, slid over to the little intercom box at one side of the desk, crawled in through one of the slits, curled up, and promptly went to sleep. It seems that Fidwell, along with his other faults, had also been a sufferer of insomnia. "I suppose," I said to Gil conversationally, "you'll be wanting a new body now." "Not necessarily. Not right away." He edged away from the blotter my desk fan was blowing in his direction. "Want to wait?" A burp nearly flipped him again, until these garlic fumes effervesced more completely from my system. "It worked out wonderfully well, though," I said, "even though you did have to put up with the garlic for a while." I brought out the gin bottle from the lower drawer. It was certainly fortunate that Gif was on hand to occupy Fidwell just after his wife murdered him. I unstoppered the bottle and raised it to my lips. "To Fidwell, departed partner and erstwhile owner of the Remy Company." "And the joke was on Mrs. Fidwell," sparkled Gil's sense of humour. "Just imagine seeing her husband up walking around, hale and hearty, just a half-hour after she had throttled the life out of him with her own two hands." "No wonder she had to be locked up," I chuckled, pouring a few drops of gin on the polished glass near my companion. "My getting the body of Pasquamine, owner of the floating stock, wasn't so bad either," he reminded me, isolating a drop of gin and flowing around it. I admitted the fact. "He nearly crushed me too when he tumbled," Gil reminded. "I'd been following him 2 weeks, waiting for his fat heart to do a flopperoo." We both laughed. I took another drink, and Gil osmosed a nip. Finally, I leaned across the desk. "Listen, Gil," I said, coldly serious. "Now that this little deal is over, how'd you like to get in on something else? Something really big?" He instantly became all ears. Naturally, only a pseudopod can do it. "After I sell out Remy," I continued, "we'll have ample funds. So, if we moved over to Washington, D.C., If you and Giff could get in touch with a couple tottering congressmen who are about ready to depart from this vale of tears. Gil caught on immediately. "TJ," he complimented, "you've got something." He fell silent, and I knew he was letting the gin and the thought trickle through him, savouring both from various angles. Then he vibrated dreamily. "I've always wanted to be a congressman, or a cabinet member, or—" his vibration dropped to little more than a whisper, "or a president." "Sorry," I said, "but I believe he's already possessed." Gil flowed around another drop of gin. "Oh well," he said, dismissing the ambition. "Guess he doesn't have much to say about things anyway." Then he brightened. "But there are some mighty fine bureaus and departments there. We could wiggle our way into one of those. A few $1 million here and there wouldn't be missed." "Attaboy! I'll take you and Giff over to Washington in the morning. Then I'll come back here and dispose of the business while the two of you are getting established." It sounded like a good idea. "Within a few years we'll be rolling in the filthy stuff." I poured a few more drops of gin on the glass top, then raised the bottle. "Here's to happy days in the Pentagon," I toasted. Our spirits were soon soaring to great heights, and, as usual under such circumstances, Gil began talking about the good old days when you could pick up a likely corpse almost anywhere, any time. "Used to be so much simpler then," he commented, flowing around one of the fresh drops. "Now you have to beat the embalmer." He chuckled. "Fairly close race at times, too. But it keeps one on one's pseudo-toes, so to speak." A combined burp and hiccup nearly flopped him off the desk. After he had regained his equilibrium, we spent an enjoyable half-hour talking of cadavers, funeral homes, and the comparative merits of inhabiting youthful or wealthy bodies, and other delightfully stimulating subjects. Then we began to sing songs, old and new. We had finished the chorus of "We Have All the Dough of Remy" for the third time, and were just getting warmed up on an extemporization of "We'll Carry On in the Pentagon," when the office door flew suddenly open and two federal boys stepped in, followed by my stupid-looking secretary. They came quickly to the desk. One of them grabbed a handful of Gil with one hand and pointed a gun at me with the other. "Just stay it you are," the officer cautioned. My dumb secretary stared at me with round, innocent eyes. "I couldn't help hearing everything you said, Mr. Nelson," she chirped, half apologetically. "Your intercom box was open. Must be a short in it somewhere, or a loose connection." The other officer picked up the little box and shook it. A surprised Giff fell out from between the slats. They have Giff and Gil in a little bottle now, tightly stoppered, and ready for shipment back home to Venus. They'll be placed on the next spaceship heading out. There is a stupid terrestrial law, you know, which makes it mandatory that all Venusians be apprehended on sight or extracted from any body they may be occupying and sent back to Venus in all possible haste. And so I shall soon be extracted from the body of T.J. Nelson, and his neck will bend double in the middle again, just the way it was when I found him shortly after his accidents. Then, in a little bottle of my own, I shall accompany Giff and Gil homeward. But don't worry, I'll be back. I'll be back just as soon as I can hitch a ride on a returning spaceboat. So take good care of yourself, my friend, and don't catch pneumonia or step in front of a truck or anything like that. Until I return. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Polite People of Pudibundia by R.A. Lafferty. Originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, January 1961. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Well, you will soon see for yourself, Marlowe. Yes, I know there are peculiar stories about the place. There are about all places. The young pilots who have been there tell some amusing tales about it. Yes, they say the people there are very polite. That is the honourable ancestor of all understatements. One of the pilots, Conrad, told us that the inhabitants must always carry 7 types of eyeglasses with them. None of the puds, you see, may ever gaze directly on another. That would be the height of impoliteness. They wear amber goggles when they go about their world at large, and these they wear when they meet a stranger. But once they are introduced to him, they must thereafter look on him through blue glasses. But at a blood relative they gaze through red, and at an in-law through yellow. There are equally interesting colours for other situations. I would like to talk to Conrad. Not that I doubt his reports. It is the things he did not report that interest me. I thought you knew he had died. Thrombosis, though he was sound enough when first certified. But if they are really people, then it should be possible to understand them. But they are not really people. They are metamorphics. They become people only out of politeness. Detail that a little. Oh, they're biped, and of the size of us. They have a chameleon-like skin that can take on any texture they please, and they possess extreme plasticity of features. You mean they can take on the appearance of people at will? So Bentley reported. I hadn't heard of him. Another of the young pilots. According to Bentley, not only do the puds take on a human appearance, they take on the appearance of the human they encounter, out of politeness, of course. Quite a tribute, though it seems extreme. Could I talk to Bentley? Also dead. A promising young man, but he reported some of the most amusing aspects of all. The circumlocutions that the puds use in speaking our language. Not only is the second person eschewed out of politeness, but in a way all the other persons also. One of them could not call you by your name, Marlowe. He would have to say, "One hears of one who hears of one of the noble name of Marlowe. One hears of one even now in his presence." Yes, that is quite a polite way of saying it, but it would seem that with all their circumlocutions they would be inefficient. Yet they are quite efficient. They do things so well that it is almost imperative that we learn from them. Yet for all our contracts, and all their extreme politeness coupled with their seeming openness, we have been able to learn almost nothing. We cannot learn the secret of the amazing productivity of the fields. According to Sharper, another of the young pilots, they suggest, though so circumspectly that it seems hardly a suggestion, certainly not a criticism, that if we were more polite to our own plants, the plants would be more productive for us, and if we gave the plants the ultimate of politeness, they would give us the ultimate of production. Can I talk to Sharper, or is he also? No, he is not dead. He was quite well till the last several days. Now, however, he is ailing, but I believe it will be possible for you to talk to him before you leave, if he does not worsen. It would still seem difficult for the puds to get anything done. Wouldn't a superior be too polite to give a reprimand to an inferior? Probably, but masters, who visited them, had a theory about it, which is that the inferior would be so polite and deferential that he would do his best to anticipate a wish or a desire, and would go to any length to learn the import of an unvoiced preference. Is Masters one of the young pilots? No, an old-timer. Now you do interest me. Dead quite a few years, but it is you who interest me, Marlowe. I have been told to give you all the information you need about the polite people of Pudibundia, and on the subject of the polite people, I must also be polite. But, saving your presence, and one hears of one who hears and all that, what in Gehenna is a captain in homicide on the solar police force going to Pudibundia about? About murder. That is all I ever go anywhere about. We once had a private motto that we would go to the end of the earth to solve a case. And now you have amended your motto to the end of the earth and beyond? We have. But what have the polite people to do with murder? Crime is unknown on Pudibundia. We believe, saving their feelings, that it may not be unknown there, and what I am going to find out is this. There have been pilots for many years who have brought back stories of the Puds, and there are still a very few, young pilots alive to tell those stories. What I am going to find out is why there are no old pilots around telling those stories. It wasn't much of a trip for a tripper, 6 weeks, and Marlowe was well received. His host also assumed the name of Marlowe out of politeness. It would have been impossible to render his own name in human speech, and it would have been impossible for him to conceive of using any name except that of his guest, with its modifiers. Yet there was no confusion. Marlowe was Marlowe, and his host was the 1,000,000 times lesser Marlowe. "We could progress much faster," said Marlowe, "if we dispensed with these formalities." "Or assumed them as already spoken," said the 1,000,000 times lesser Marlowe. "For this, in private, but only in the strictest privacy, we use the deferential ball. Within it are all the formulae written minutely. You have but to pass the ball from hand to hand every time you speak, and it is as if the amenities were spoken. I will give you this for the time of your stay. I beg you never to forget to pass it from hand to hand every time you speak. Should you forget, I would not, of course, be allowed to notice it, but when you were gone, I should be forced to kill myself for the shame of it. For private reasons I wish to avoid this, and therefore beseech you to be careful." The 1,000,000 times lesser Marlowe, hereafter to be called OMTLM for convenience, but not out of any lack of politeness, gave Marlowe a deferential ball, about the size of a ping-pong ball, and so they talked. "As a police official, I am particularly interested in the crime situation on Pud," said Marlowe. "An index of 0 is, well, if I could find a politer word I would use it, suspicious. And as you are, as well as I can determine, the head police official here, though in politeness your office would have another name, I am hoping that you can give me information." "Saving your grace, and formula over formula, what would you have me tell you about?" "Suppose that a burglar, for politeness' sake called something else, were apprehended by a policeman. Likewise, what would happen?" "Why, the policeman, not so called, and yet we must be frank, would rattle his glottis in the prescribed manner." "Rattle his I see. He would clear his throat with the appropriate sound." "And then the burglar, not so called?" "Would be covered with shame, it is true, but not fatally. For the peace of his own soul he would leave the sight in as dignified a manner as possible." "With or without boodle?" "Naturally without. One apprehended in the act is obliged to abandon his loot. That is only common politeness." "I see. And if the burglar, not so called, remains unapprehended, how is the loss of the goods or property recorded?" "It goes into the coefficient of general diminution of merchandise, which is to say shrinkage, waste, or loss. At certain times and places this coefficient becomes alarmingly large. Then it is necessary to use extraordinary care, and in extreme cases a thrice-removed burglar may become so ashamed of himself that he will die." "That he will die of shame? Is that a euphemism?" "Let's say that it is a euphemism of a euphemism." "Thrice removed, I imagine. And what of other crimes?" Here OMTLM rattled his glottis in a nervous manner, and Marlowe hurriedly transferred his differential ball to the other hand, having nearly forgotten it. "There being no crime, we can hardly speak of other crimes," said OMTLM. "But perhaps in another matter of speaking you refer to—" "Crimes of violence," said Marlowe. "Saving your presence, and formula of a formula, what would we have to be violent about? What possible cause?" "The usual: greed, lust, jealousy, anger, revenge, plain perversity." "Here also it is possible for one to die of shame, sometimes the offender, sometimes the victim, sometimes both. A jealous person might permit both his wife and her paramour to die of shame, and the state in turn might permit him to perish likewise, unless there were circumstances to modify the degree of shame. Then he might still continue to live, often in circumscribed circumstances, for a set number of years. Each case must be decided on its own merits." "I understand your meaning, but why build a fence around it?" "I do not know what you mean." "I believe that you do. Why are the polite people of Pudibundia so polite? Is it simply custom?" "It is more than that," said the polite Pud. "Then there is a real reason for it, and can you tell it to me?" "There is a real reason for it. I cannot tell it to you now, though, and perhaps not ever. But there is a chance that you may be given a demonstration of it just before you leave, and if you are very wise, you may be able then to guess the reason. I believe that there are several who have guessed it. I hope that we will have time for other discussions before you leave our sphere, and I sincerely do hope that your stay on Pudibundia is a pleasant one. And now, saving your presence, we must part. Formula of a formula." "Formula of a formula and all that," said Marlowe, and went to discover the pleasures of Pudibundia. Among the pleasures of Pud was Mitzi, miniature image 1,000 times removed of the zestful Irma, who had now shaped up into something very nice, and shaped up is the correct term. At first Marlowe was shocked by the appearance of all the females he met on Pud. Crude-featured, almost horse-faced. How could they all look like that? And he was even more shocked when he finally realized the reason. He had become used to the men there looking like himself out of politeness, and this abomination, was the female version of his own appearance. But he was a man of resources. He took from his pocket a small picture of Irma that he always carried, and showed it to the most friendly of the girls. "Could you possibly—" "Look like that? Why, of course. Let me study it for a moment. Now then." So the girl assumed the face of Irma. "Incredible," said Marlowe. "Except Irma is red-headed." "You have only to ask. The photo is not coloured, and so I did not know. I will try this shade to start with." "Close, but could you turn it just a little darker?" "Of course." And there she was, Irma, of the most interesting face and wonderful hair. But the picture had been of the face only. Below that the girl was a sack. If only there were some way to convey what was lacking. "You are still not pleased with me?" said the miniature image 1,000 times removed of the zestful Irma, Mitzi. "But you have only to demonstrate. Show me with your hands." Marlowe, with his hands, sculptured in the air the figure of Irma as he remembered it, and Mitzi resumed the form. First face on, then face away, then in profile. And when they had it roughly, they perfected it. A little more here, a little less there. But there were points where his memory failed him. "If you could only give me an idea of the convolutions of her ears," said Mitzi, "and the underlying structure of the metatarsus. My only desire is to please. or shall I improvise where you do not remember?" "Yes, do that, Mitzi." And how that girl could improvise! Marlowe and Mitzi were now buddies. They made a large evening of it. They tied one on. Formula over formula, but they tied one on. They went on a thrice-removed bender. At the Beetlejuice Bar and Grill, they partook of the cousin of the alcohol itself in the form of the Nono-Rumbazoid, made of 9 kinds of rum. At the B-flat Starlight Club, they listened to the newest and most exciting music on all Pudibundia. At Alligator John's, one checks his inhibitions at the door. Here one also checks his deferential ball. Of course, the formulae are built into the walls, and at each exchange it is always assumed that they are said. But the Iris Room is really the ultimate. The light comes through 7 different colours of glass, and it is very dim when it arrives. And there the more daring remove their goggles entirely and go about without them in the multicoloured twilight. This is illegal. It is even foolhardy. There is no earthly equivalent to it. To divest oneself and disport with nudists would be tame in comparison. But Mitzi and her friends were the reckless generation, and the Iris Room was their rendezvous. The orgy will not be detailed here. The floor show was wild. Yet we cannot credit the rumour that the comedian was so crude as to look directly at the audience even in that coloured twilight, or they so gauche as to laugh outright at the jokes. They who had been taught always to murmur, "One knows of one who knows of one who ventures to smile." Yet there was no doubting that the Iris Room was a lively place, and when they left it at dawn, Marlowe was pleased and sleepy and tipsy. There was a week of pleasure on Pudibundia, swimming with Mitzi down at the West Beach, gormandizing with Mitzi at Gastrophiles, dancing with Mitzi, pub crawling, romancing, carrying on generally. The money exchange was favourable, and Marlowe was on an expense account. It was a delightful time. But still, he did not forget the job he was on, and in the midst of his pleasure he sought always for information. "When I return here," he said slyly, "we will do the many things that times does not allow. When I come back here—" "But you will not return," said Mitzi. "Nobody ever does." "And why not? It is surely a pleasant place to return to. Why won't I return?" "If you cannot guess, then I cannot tell you. Do you have to know why?" "Yes, I have to know why. That is why I came here, to find out. To find out why the young men who come here will never be able to return here, or to anywhere else." "I can't tell you." "Then give me a clue." In the Iris Room was a clue. It was not till the colour-filtered light intruded between us that we might safely take off our goggles. I would save you if I could. I want you to come back. But those higher in authority make the decisions. When you leave, you will not return here, or anywhere else. But already one has spoken to one who has spoken to one who has spoken too much. There is a point beyond which politeness is no longer a virtue, Mitzi. I know. If I could change it, I would. So the period of the visit was at an end, and Marlowe was at his last conference with OMTLM, following which he would leave Pudibundia, perhaps forever. "Is there anything at all else you would like to know?" asked OMTLM. "There's almost everything that I still want to know. I have found out nothing." "Then ask." "I don't know how. If I knew the questions to ask, it is possible that I already know the answers." "Yes, that is entirely possible." OMTLM seemed to look at him with amused eyes, and yet the eyes were hidden behind purple goggles. Marlowe had never seen the eyes of OMTLM. He had never seen the eyes of any of the Puds. Even in the Iris Room, in that strangely coloured light. It had not been possible to see their eyes. "Are you compelling me to do something?" asked Marlowe. "I may be compelling you to think of the question that has eluded you. Would you swear that I have not been given some fatal sickness?" "I can swear that to the best of my knowledge you have not." "Are you laughing at me with your eyes?" "No, my eyes have compassion for you." "I have to see them." "You are asking that?" "Yes, I believe the answer to my question is there," Marlowe said firmly. OMTLM took off his purple goggles. His were clear, intelligent eyes, and there was genuine compassion in them. "Thank you," said Marlowe. "If the answer is there, it still eludes me. I have failed in my mission for information, but I will return again. I will still find out what is it that is wrong here." "No, you will not return." "What will prevent me?" asked Marlowe. "Your death in a very few weeks." "What will I die of?" "What did all your young pilots die of?" "But you swore that you did not know of any sickness I could have caught here," Marlowe cried. "That was true when I said it. It was not true a moment later." "Did all the pilots ask to see your eyes?" "Yes, all. Curiosity is a failing of you earthlings." "Is it that the direct gaze of the Puds kills?" "Yes. Even ourselves it would kill. That is why we have our eyes always shielded. That is also why we erect another shield, that of our ritual politeness, so that we may never forget that too intimate an encounter of our persons may be fatal." "Then you have just murdered me?" "Let us say, rather, that one hears of one who killed unwillingly." "Why did you do it to me?" demanded Marlowe. "You asked to see my eyes. It would not be polite to refuse." "It takes you several weeks to kill. I can do it in a few seconds." "You would be wrong to try. A second glance kills instantly." "Let's see if it's faster than a gun." But OMTLM had not lied. It is not polite to lie on Pudibundia. Marlowe died instantly. And that is why, though you may sometimes hear a young pilot tell amusing stories immediately, oh very immediately, on his return from Pudibundia, you will never find an old pilot who has ever been there. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. If you like this sort of human read narration, please consider becoming a member of the channel. Members not only get rid of some of their unwanted money, but also may access the stories a whole week before everyone else. And that's it, really. Oh yes, the stories are and will remain AI free. And free of charge, of course.